The police officers looked at that thin, weak horse and made an immediate decision. They rejected it without thinking twice. But what no one expected was the attitude of a humble farmer who saw something in that animal that others didn't. What happened next left everyone speechless. Stay until the end to discover this unbelievable twist, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories like this. Sheriff Thomas Harrison leaned against the worn wooden fence of the police stable, his weathered face creased with concern as he watched the once proud police horse standing listlessly in the corner. Sentinel, as the aging horse was named, had seen better days. His ribs protruded beneath a dull coat, his hooves showed signs of injury, and his eyes lacked the spark that had once made him the pride of the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department. "I'm telling you, Tom, it's time to make the hard call," Deputy Chief Warren Parker said, his voice carrying across the stable yard. "The department's facing budget cuts, and we can't justify keeping him around anymore." The small town of Willow Creek, nestled in the rolling hills of Kentucky's horse country, had fallen on hard times. The once thriving community was struggling with economic downturn, and the sheriff's department wasn't immune to the financial strain. "He's served this department for 12 years, Thomas argued, his voice soft but firm. "Sentinel deserves better than to be treated like yesterday's trash." Warren sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "I don't like it any more than you do, but we've got to cut costs somewhere. The mayor's breathing down my neck about the budget." As the two men continued their debate, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the stable entrance. Ethan Miller, a widowed farmer with calloused hands and a perpetual stoop to his shoulders, had come to town for supplies when he overheard the conversation. His own small farm was barely staying afloat, and his teenage daughter Abigail was the only bright spot in his otherwise difficult existence. "Excuse me," Ethan said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but carried a certainty that made both officers turn. "I couldn't help overhearing. What's going to happen to the horse?" Warren gave Ethan a dismissive once-over, taking in his worn overalls and weathered boots. "We're considering our options," he said diplomatically. "You mean you're going to put him down?" Ethan translated bluntly. Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with the direct statement. "We don't have many choices, Mr. Miller." Ethan took another step forward, his eyes fixed on Sentinel. Something about the horse's dignified suffering resonated with him. "I'll take him," he offered suddenly. The declaration was met with a moment of stunned silence before Warren let out a bark of laughter. "You? No offense, Miller, but your farm's hanging by a thread. Everyone knows you can barely feed yourself and that daughter of yours." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I've got enough to share," he insisted, "and Abby's been asking for a horse for years." "This isn't some pony for a little girl," Thomas cautioned. "Sentinel's a trained police horse. He's got special needs." "I know horses," Ethan replied simply. "I worked with them before I took over my father's farm." Warren exchanged a look with Thomas, a silent communication passing between them. "Well," Warren finally said with a shrug, "if you want to take on another mouth to feed, who am I to stop you? Saves us the trouble and expense." Thomas frowned at his superior's callousness, but remained silent. He'd known Ethan for years. They'd gone to school together before their paths diverged. Thomas had joined law enforcement while Ethan had stayed on his family farm, eventually marrying his high school sweetheart, Sarah. When Sarah had passed away from illness 5 years ago, leaving Ethan alone with their daughter, the whole town had felt the loss. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" Thomas asked quietly. Ethan nodded, his gaze returning to Sentinel. "Everyone deserves a second chance." By sunset, paperwork had been hastily filled out, and Sentinel was loaded into Ethan's old truck with the makeshift trailer attached. Along with the horse came his worn police saddle and basic equipment, items the department had been planning to discard anyway. As Ethan drove the winding road back to his small farm outside town, he couldn't help wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. His farm was struggling, the crops weren't yielding as they should, and the old farmhouse needed repairs he couldn't afford. Abigail was working part-time after school to help make ends meet, a responsibility no 16-year-old should have to bear. When he pulled into the dirt driveway, Abigail was waiting on the porch, her long brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes widened as she spotted the trailer. "Dad, what's this?" she asked, hurrying down the steps. "Meet Sentinel," Ethan said, trying to infuse his voice with an enthusiasm he didn't entirely feel. "He's a retired police horse." Abigail's face lit up, then quickly sobered, as she got a better look at the animal's condition. "He's so thin," she whispered, reaching out a gentle hand toward Sentinel's nose. "He's had a rough time," Ethan acknowledged, "but we're going to change that." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Abigail devoted what little spare time and resources they had to Sentinel's care. They cleared out the old stable at the back of the property, a structure that hadn't housed animals in years. Abigail researched horse nutrition at the town library, carefully planning a diet that would help him regain his strength without breaking their meager budget. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Sentinel began to respond to their care. His coat became a little less dull, his eyes a little more alert. One morning, Ethan found Abigail in the paddock, talking softly to the horse as she brushed him. "I think he understands me, Dad," she said without looking up. "Sometimes he looks at me like he knows exactly what I'm saying." Ethan smiled, leaning against the fence. Horses are smart creatures, especially ones with training. It was during the cleaning of Sentinel's old police saddle that Ethan made a discovery. Tucked into a hidden compartment was a tarnished badge, inscribed with a registration number and the name Sentinel. But there was something else, a small flash drive sealed in a waterproof pouch. Curious, Ethan plugged it into their aging computer that evening after Abigail had gone to bed. What he found left him cold. Case notes about an operation against a smuggling ring that had been operating through Willow Creek. Sentinel had been part of that operation, but something had gone wrong. The notes were fragmentary, as if someone had deliberately deleted portions of the files. The next morning, Ethan was in the stable checking Sentinel's hooves when a vehicle pulled into his driveway. Through the stable door, he recognized Officer Jason Reynolds, a man who joined the force only a few years ago. Ethan hadn't had many dealings with him, but something about the man's overly casual demeanor as he approached made Ethan instantly wary. "Morning, Miller," Reynolds called out, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Heard you took in our old horse." Ethan straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's right. Just thought I'd check in, see how he's doing," Reynolds said, peering past Ethan into the stable where Sentinel stood. "Old partners, you know." But something in the way Reynolds studied the horse, with calculation rather than affection, told Ethan that the man had never been Sentinel's partner. And as Reynolds' gaze flickered briefly to the saddle hanging on the wall, Ethan knew with sudden certainty that the flash drive was exactly what the officer had come looking for. "Actually, I don't recall seeing you working with Sentinel before," Ethan said carefully, keeping his tone casual. "Thomas Harrison was his main handler, wasn't he?" Reynolds' smile tightened. "Sure, Tom spent a lot of time with him, but we all worked with the department horses at some point." He stepped closer to the stable door. "Mind if I take a look? For old time's sake." Ethan moved subtly to block the entrance. "He's still adjusting. Vet said to limit his contact with strangers for now." "Vet, huh?" Reynolds arched an eyebrow. "Didn't realize you had the money for veterinary care, Miller." "Dr. Lawson's daughter rides with Abigail at school. She offered to check him out as a favor," Ethan lied smoothly, silently thanking his lucky stars that Reynolds wouldn't know the local vet's family situation. Reynolds nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "Well, if you need any advice on handling a police horse, you know where to find us." He handed Ethan a business card. "My direct line. Call anytime." After Reynolds drove away, Ethan examined the saddle more thoroughly. The hidden compartment, had been well disguised. He'd only found it by accident when cleaning. If Reynolds knew about it, that meant he was involved with whatever operation had led to Sentinel's forced retirement. And if he was looking for the flash drive now, it meant the information was still valuable. That evening, Ethan drove into town and parked outside the Willow Creek Diner. Through the window, he could see Thomas Harrison having his usual Friday dinner, alone at the counter. Ethan had questions, and his old schoolmate seemed like the only person he could trust. The bell above the door jingled as Ethan entered. Thomas looked up, surprise registering on his face. "Ethan," he said with a nod. "Don't usually see you in town this time of day." Ethan slid onto the stool beside him. "Need to talk to you, Tom, about Sentinel." Thomas's expression grew guarded. "What about him?" "Reynolds came by the farm today. Said he was checking on his old partner." Thomas snorted. "Reynolds never worked with Sentinel. He transferred here 6 months ago from some city department. Why would he?" He stopped abruptly, a realization dawning on his face. "What happened to Sentinel, Tom?" Ethan asked quietly. "Why was he really retired?" Thomas glanced around the diner, then lowered his voice. "Not here," he muttered. "Meet me at Brewer's Point in an hour." Brewer's Point was a lookout spot outside of town where they'd spent countless evenings in their youth watching the sun set over the Kentucky hills. When Ethan arrived, Thomas was already there, leaning against his police cruiser. "Sentinel was part of an operation about 8 months ago," Thomas began without preamble. "We'd been tracking a smuggling ring moving contraband through our county. Sentinel and I were on patrol near the old Harrington warehouses when we stumbled onto a meeting. I radioed for backup, but before they arrived, someone hit me from behind." Thomas rubbed the back of his head reflexively. "When I came to, I was alone. Sentinel was gone. They found him 2 days later, wandering near the state highway, injured and spooked. The official report said I'd been negligent, left the scene unsecured. The investigation into the smuggling ring was quietly dropped." "And you just accepted that?" Ethan asked incredulously. Thomas's eyes flashed with anger. "Of course not. But Chief Parker made it clear that pushing the issue would cost me my badge. I've got 2 kids in college, Ethan. I couldn't risk it." So they forced Sentinel into retirement to cover it up," Ethan mused. "But why would Reynolds be interested in him now?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know, but be careful, Ethan. These aren't people you want to cross." Back at the farm, Abigail was waiting up despite the late hour. "Dad, you've got to see this," she said excitedly, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the paddock where she'd been working with Sentinel. "Abby, it's dark out." "I set up the floodlights," she interrupted. "Just watch." Ethan observed in amazement as his daughter put Sentinel through a series of complex maneuvers, movements he recognized from police demonstrations he'd seen in town parades. "How did you figure this out?" he asked when she finished. Abigail's eyes were bright with excitement. "I found an old police training manual online and recognized some of the commands. He remembered all of them, Dad, and look what else he can do." She gave a hand signal Ethan didn't recognize, and Sentinel immediately moved to stand between her and an imaginary threat, his body creating a protective barrier. "That's crowd control positioning," she explained. "But watch this." Another signal, and Sentinel dropped to his knees, creating a lower profile. "This one's not in any manual I could find," Abigail said. "I think it's specific to Sentinel's training." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The horse had been trained for situations more dangerous than routine police work, possibly including the smuggling operation Thomas had mentioned. As if confirming his thoughts, a distant sound caught Sentinel's attention. The horse's ears pricked forward, his head turning toward the property line that bordered the dense woods. Ethan strained to hear what had alerted the animal and caught the faint snap of a twig breaking. "Inside, Abby," he said quietly, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Now." "But Dad, now," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Once Abigail was safely in the house, Ethan circled the paddock, pretending to check the fencing while scanning the tree line. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. He considered calling Thomas, but hesitated. If there was someone out there watching, he didn't want to tip them off that he suspected anything. The next morning, Ethan found fresh tire tracks on the dirt road that ran past their property. Someone had been parked there for some time, based on the disturbed gravel and cigarette butts he found nearby. Over breakfast, he made a decision. "Abby, I think you should stay with Aunt Claire for a few days." His sister-in-law had offered, many times, to have Abigail stay with her family in Louisville, especially during school breaks. He'd always declined, reluctant to be separated from his daughter, but now her safety took precedence. "Is this about last night?" Abigail asked perceptively. "Dad, what's going on?" Ethan hesitated. His daughter was mature for her age. She'd had to be after losing her mother, but he didn't want to burden her with his concerns. "I just think a change of scenery would be good for you," he said finally. "And Sentinel and I need to work on some repairs around the farm." Abigail's eyes narrowed. "You're not telling me something." "It's nothing to worry about," Ethan assured her, knowing the lie would be transparent to his perceptive daughter. "Just some business I need to take care of." That afternoon, as he watched Abigail's bus pull away toward Louisville, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had become entangled in something dangerous. While Sentinel grazed in the paddock, Ethan examined the flash drive's contents again. This time, more methodically. Among the fragmented reports was a list of dates and locations. One of the locations was the Harrington warehouses Thomas had mentioned. Another was a private airstrip outside of Willow Creek, owned by Councilman Richard Harrington, one of the town's wealthiest residents. The dates corresponded with low-flying aircraft reported by local farmers, reports that had been dismissed by Chief Parker as routine crop dusters. As Ethan dug deeper, a pattern emerged. The smuggling operation wasn't just passing through Willow Creek, it was centered there, protected by someone with enough influence to quash investigations and silence questions. A knock at the door interrupted his research. Ethan quickly closed the laptop and went to answer, expecting Thomas, perhaps, or one of his neighbors. Instead, he found Chief Warren Parker standing on his porch, an official-looking document in his hand. "Evening, Miller," Parker said, his tone coldly professional. "Sorry to disturb you, but I've got some unfortunate news. There's been a complaint filed about the horse you acquired from the department." "A complaint?" Ethan echoed. "From whom?" "Reed. One of my officers noticed the animal appeared malnourished during a routine patrol," Parker continued, ignoring the question. "Given the circumstances, I'm afraid I need to issue a formal inspection notice. We'll be sending animal control to evaluate the situation tomorrow morning." He handed Ethan the document, an official notice for inspection with the county seal prominently displayed. "This is ridiculous," Ethan protested. "Sentinel's health has improved significantly since I took him in." Parker's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you've got nothing to worry about, have you? Unless, of course, there's some other reason you're reluctant to have officials looking around your property." The implication was clear. This wasn't about Sentinel's welfare, it was a pretext for a search. As Parker turned to leave, he paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "By the way," he added casually, "I understand Sentinel came with some old equipment, department property technically. We'll need that returned as well." As Chief Parker's cruiser disappeared down the driveway, Ethan's mind raced. The inspection was scheduled for 9 a.m., less than 12 hours away. He needed to act quickly. First, he hid the flash drive in a hollowed-out book in his father's old study. Then, he turned his attention to the saddle, the most obvious piece. of department property Parker could be referring to. Rather than hiding it, which would only confirm their suspicions, Ethan decided on a bolder approach. He spent the evening meticulously cleaning and restoring the saddle, removing all traces of the hidden compartment and restitching the leather to eliminate evidence it had ever existed. By dawn, Ethan had also improved Sentinel's paddock, freshened his bedding, and organized his feed supplies to present the best possible appearance for the inspection. The horse seemed to sense the tension, standing alert in his enclosure as the sound of vehicles approached at precisely 9 a.m. Parker had brought reinforcements, Reynolds and another officer Ethan didn't recognize, plus a woman in the tan uniform of the County Animal Control. "This is Dr. Wilson from Animal Control," Parker introduced briskly. "She'll be evaluating the horse's condition." Dr. Wilson, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, nodded at Ethan. "Let's make this simple, Mr. Miller. I need to examine the animal, take some photographs, and document his environment and feeding regimen." "Of course," Ethan agreed, leading her toward the paddock while acutely aware of Reynolds peering into the barn, where the saddle was prominently displayed on a rack. As Dr. Wilson examined Sentinel, her professional demeanor gradually softened. "You've been treating his hooves properly," she noted, inspecting the once-injured feet, "and his weight is improving, though he's still underweight." "I've been following a specialized diet plan for senior horses," Ethan explained, showing her the feeding schedule Abigail had meticulously created. "He was in rough shape when I got him, but he's been making steady progress." Dr. Wilson made notes on her tablet. "Honestly, Mr. Miller, I'm not seeing evidence of neglect. Quite the opposite." She lowered her voice. "Can I ask why Animal Control was called in? This doesn't seem like our usual type of case." Before Ethan could respond, Reynolds emerged from the barn, the saddle in his hands. "Found the department property, Chief," he called out. "Cleaned up nice, hasn't it, Miller?" "I assumed you'd want it in good condition when returned," Ethan replied evenly. Parker strode over to inspect the saddle, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. Ethan could see the moment the chief realized the hidden compartment had been removed. A flash of anger quickly. "Controlled. We'll take this with us," Parker said curtly. "Dr. Wilson, your findings?" The veterinarian stood her ground. "I see no evidence of animal neglect or mistreatment, Chief Parker. In fact, given the horse's reported condition upon transfer to Mr. Miller, I would say his care has been exemplary." Parker's jaw tightened. "I see. Well, we'll still need to file a follow-up report. Reynolds, get the saddle in the cruiser." As they prepared to leave, the third officer, who had been silently surveying the property, approached Ethan. "Nice place you've got here, Miller. Shame about those recent break-ins at farms in the area. You might want to consider better security." The thinly veiled threat hung in the air as the officers departed, leaving Ethan alone with Dr. Wilson. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "I don't know what's going on between you and the sheriff's department, but that was no routine animal welfare check." She handed him her card. "Call me if you need a witness to the horse's condition. On the record." After she left, Ethan went to the barn and ran his hand along the wooden beam, where he'd hidden a second copy of the flash drive's contents. Photos taken of the screen with his phone, printed and sealed in a waterproof pouch. The originals might be gone with the saddle, but he still had the evidence. That evening, Thomas called from a payphone, his voice tense. "Ethan, I heard about the inspection. What did they find?" "Nothing," Ethan replied. "But they took the saddle." Thomas swore under his breath. "Listen, I've been doing some digging. There's a connection between the smuggling operation and Harrington Enterprises. Richard Harrington's company has been struggling financially for years, but somehow he's still one of the wealthiest men in the county." "Money laundering?" Ethan suggested. "Possibly. But here's the interesting part. 3 months before the incident with Sentinel, Harrington made a generous donation to the police department's mounted unit. specifically requested that the funds be used for new equipment and training. Training that would have involved Sentinel, Ethan realized. Tom, I think Sentinel might have been used to transport something during that training. Something hidden in that saddle compartment. That would explain why they're so interested in getting it back, Thomas agreed. But if they've got the saddle now, why would they still be watching your farm? The question sent a chill through Ethan. Because they think I know more than I do, or because Sentinel saw something he shouldn't have, Thomas finished. Horses don't forget, Ethan, and they can't be bribed or threatened into silence. After hanging up, Ethan checked all the doors and windows, setting up makeshift alarms with tin cans and fishing line. He then called Abigail at his sister-in-law's home, ensuring she was safe and encouraging her to stay in Louisville a few more days, despite her protests. That night, a storm rolled in across the Kentucky hills, bringing with it howling winds and driving rain. Ethan checked on Sentinel, making sure the horse was secure in his stall before retreating to the farmhouse. The old building creaked and groaned under the assault of the elements, making it impossible to distinguish normal storm sounds from potential intruders. Around midnight, the storm intensified. A particularly loud crash sent Ethan bolting upright in his chair where he'd been dozing. It had come from the direction of the barn. Grabbing his shotgun and a flashlight, he ventured out into the tempest. The barn door was swinging wildly in the wind, banging against the frame, the source of the crash. But as Ethan approached to secure it, Sentinel's distressed whinny cut through the storm's cacophony. Inside, Ethan found the horse agitated, stamping and snorting, his attention fixed on the back of the barn. Following Sentinel's gaze, Ethan spotted a broken window and, beneath it, muddy footprints that didn't belong to him. Someone had been in the barn recently enough that Sentinel was still on alert. Ethan raised his shotgun, sweeping the flashlight beam across the shadowy corners of the building. "I know you're here," he called out. "Show yourself!" Only the howling wind answered. Ethan methodically checked every possible hiding place, finding nothing until he reached the tack room. The door was ajar, though he distinctly remembered closing it earlier. Inside, the place had been ransacked, saddle blankets thrown aside, feed bins overturned, tools scattered. They were looking for the flash drive, Ethan realized, and they hadn't found it, which meant they would be back. When morning came, bringing with it clear skies and the aftermath of the storm, Ethan made a difficult decision. He couldn't leave Sentinel vulnerable to another intrusion. The horse needed to be somewhere safe while Ethan figured out how to handle the situation. With Abigail still in Louisville, Ethan called the only person he trusted who had the facilities to temporarily house a horse, Dr. Wilson from Animal Control. To his relief, she agreed without hesitation to board Sentinel at her private farm outside the county line. "I'm not sure what trouble you're in, Mr. Miller," she said when he delivered Sentinel later that day. "But this horse has clearly been through enough already." "It's better if you don't know the details," Ethan told her. "But thank you, this means more than you know." With Sentinel safely away from the farm, Ethan drove to the local newspaper office. The Willow Creek Gazette was a small operation, but its editor, Margaret Carson, had a reputation for fearlessness in pursuing stories that mattered to the community. "Ethan Miller," she greeted him with surprise when he walked in. "Haven't seen you in town much since Sarah's passing. What brings you to the Gazette?" "I need to talk to you about a story," Ethan said, closing the door to her office. "Off the record for now." Margaret leaned forward, her reporter's instincts clearly piqued. "I'm listening." Ethan laid out what he knew: the smuggling operation, Sentinel's involvement, the subsequent cover-up, and the threatening behavior of Parker and his officers. Margaret took notes, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "This is serious, Ethan," she said when he finished. "You're accusing the chief of police of corruption, possibly worse." "I have evidence," Ethan replied, producing the printouts. From the flash drive, Margaret examined them thoughtfully. It's compelling, but not definitive. We'd need more to run with this. She tapped her pen against the desk. What about this Officer Harrison you mentioned? Would he go on record? Ethan hesitated. He's worried about his job, his pension. He's got kids in college. Understandable, Margaret nodded. But we need someone inside the department to corroborate this, or it's just speculation. As they discussed possibilities, Margaret's assistant knocked on the door. Sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this. She handed Margaret a tablet displaying the Gazette's website. The headline made Ethan's blood run cold. Local farmer, accused of horse theft. Sheriff's Department files charges. According to the article, Chief Parker had held a press conference that morning, announcing that Ethan Miller was being charged with theft of police property, specifically a trained police horse valued at over $10,000. The basis for the charge was a technicality in the transfer paperwork, which Parker claimed had never been properly authorized. They're trying to silence me, Ethan realized. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Or force you to return Sentinel so they can eliminate the evidence. They don't know I've moved him, Ethan said. And they need to keep thinking he's at the farm while I figure this out. You'll need a lawyer, Margaret pointed out. These charges could mean jail time. I can't afford a decent attorney, Ethan admitted. Margaret considered this. My brother-in-law is a lawyer in Lexington. He does pro bono work sometimes for cases with public interest implications. Let me call him. As Margaret made the call, Ethan stared at the article, a sick feeling in his stomach. Parker was playing hardball, using the legal system to corner him. But the chief had made one critical mistake. By filing public charges, he'd drawn attention to a situation he'd previously tried to keep quiet. And attention was exactly what Ethan needed to expose the truth. 2 days later, Ethan stood on the courthouse steps beside James Carson, Margaret's brother-in-law, who had agreed to represent him. The arraignment had drawn a surprising crowd of local farmers and townspeople, many of whom Ethan had known his entire life. Not guilty, Ethan had firmly declared to the judge, while Parker and Reynolds watched from the prosecution's table with barely concealed anger. Outside, James briefed Ethan on their strategy. The paperwork for Sentinel's transfer may have been irregular, but it was completed and signed by an authorized officer. They can't prove criminal intent, especially since you've been openly caring for the horse on your property. What about the theft of police equipment charge? Ethan asked, referring to the additional allegation Parker had added at the last minute. That's weaker still, James assured him. The equipment was included in the transfer, noted as accompanying tack and gear on the form Officer Harrison signed. They're reaching, Ethan. As they spoke, a small group approached. Farmers from neighboring properties who had rallied to Ethan's defense. Among them was Henry Jenkins, whose farm shared a border with Ethan's. We heard what they're trying to do to you, Henry said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. It's not right, and we won't stand for it. Ethan was touched by the show of support. Thank you, but this could get complicated. Parker has influence in this town. So do farmers, Henry retorted, and there are more of us than there are of him. The community's backing gave Ethan an idea. That evening, after discussing it with James, he invited Margaret to his farm, along with several neighbors and Thomas Harrison, who had agreed to meet them secretly. I've been thinking, Ethan began once they were all gathered in his living room. Parker's using the legal system against me, but maybe we can use something else against him. Public opinion. Margaret leaned forward. What are you suggesting? A community event, Ethan said. The spring equestrian competition is coming, up in 2 weeks. It's the biggest gathering in the county. What if Sentinel competed? Thomas looked skeptical. In his condition, against younger horses? He's been improving every day, Ethan argued. And Abigail's been working with him. He remembers his training. It's not about winning, it's about being seen. If Parker's trying to portray me as a horse thief who's neglecting Sentinel, let's put the lie to that in the most public way possible. James considered this. It would certainly generate sympathy, possible witnesses for character testimony. And it would buy us time, Margaret added. The court date isn't for another month. If we can rally public support behind you and Sentinel, Parker might find it harder to pursue these charges. The plan set in motion, Ethan brought Sentinel back from Dr. Wilson's farm the next day. Abigail returned from Louisville, thrilled by the prospect of competing with Sentinel, despite the serious circumstances that had prompted the idea. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek about the unusual entrant in the upcoming competition. Some scoffed at the notion of an aging police horse competing, while others expressed admiration for Ethan and Abigail's dedication. The local feed store owner offered discounted supplements to help Sentinel prepare, and several retired trainers volunteered their expertise. Parker was not pleased with the growing support for Ethan. "They're making a spectacle of this," he complained to Reynolds in his office. "If that horse performs well in the competition, it undermines our entire case." "So we make sure it doesn't perform well," Reynolds suggested, his voice low. Parker gave him a sharp look. "Nothing that could be traced back to us. Harrington's already breathing down my neck about this situation." That night, a mysterious fire broke out in Ethan's stable. Fortunately, both Ethan and Abigail were awake, working late with Sentinel on his training routines. They managed to extinguish the flames before major damage occurred. But the message was clear. Someone wanted to stop them at any cost. The fire marshal noted signs of arson, but found no conclusive evidence pointing to specific perpetrators. When Thomas heard about the incident, he arranged for off-duty officers he trusted to take turns keeping watch over Ethan's farm. A gesture that risked his career, but demonstrated his commitment to justice. In the aftermath of the fire, Abigail was cleaning up debris in what remained of an old storage section when she discovered a weathered, leather-bound book wedged behind a loose board. Inside was a diary, its entries dated over 15 years ago, written by the previous stable master. From the police department, the final entries detailed suspicious activities involving several high-ranking officers and mentioned a young horse newly acquired for the force, Sentinel. "Dad, look at this!" Abigail called out, showing Ethan the diary. "It says they specifically selected Sentinel because he was unusually calm around aircraft and wouldn't spook during special operations." Ethan studied the diary carefully. "This could be the link we need. The old stable master must have hidden this here before he retired." The diary didn't provide explicit details of criminal activities, but it recorded dates, times, and cryptic notes about special deliveries that aligned perfectly with the data from the flash drive. Most importantly, it mentioned Chief Parker by name, noting his unusual interest in Sentinel's training from the very beginning. With this new evidence, Ethan and James revised their strategy. Rather than merely defending against the theft charges, they would file a countersuit alleging harassment and misuse of police authority. Margaret agreed to run a carefully worded story about the upcoming competition and the unusual circumstances surrounding Sentinel's retirement, hinting at broader issues within the department without making direct accusations that could trigger a libel suit. As the day of the competition approached, Abigail's work with Sentinel began to show remarkable results. The once listless horse now moved with growing confidence, executing complex maneuvers with precision. While still not at his peak physical condition, his intelligence and training were evident to anyone who watched him work. "He's remembering more every day," Abigail told her father excitedly after a particularly successful training session. "It's like he wants to prove himself." The night before the competition, Ethan received an unexpected visitor, Lisa Harrington, Councilman Richard Harrington's daughter. Despite being from one of the wealthiest families in the county, Lisa had always been known for her independence and integrity, openly disagreeing with her father on many issues. "I needed to talk to you privately," she explained, glancing nervously over her shoulder as Ethan invited her inside. "I've been hearing things about my father's business dealings, and then I saw the article about your horse in the Gazette." Lisa revealed that she had accidentally discovered financial documents in her father's study, showing large, unexplained cash deposits coinciding with the dates in the stable master's diary. When she had questioned her father about them, he had reacted with uncharacteristic anger, forbidding her from mentioning the matter again. "I don't know what my father's involved in," Lisa admitted, "but I know he and Chief Parker have been friends for years. They meet privately at our lake house at least once a month." This confirmation of the connection between Harrington and Parker strengthened Ethan's resolve. With Lisa's reluctant agreement to testify if necessary, James believed they could potentially force an official investigation into both men's activities. The morning of the competition dawned bright and clear, drawing the largest crowd the Willow Creek Equestrian Center had seen in years. News of the unusual circumstances had spread throughout the county, bringing curious spectators and reporters from neighboring towns. Margaret's article had done its work, framing the event as a redemption story for both Ethan and Sentinel. As Abigail prepared Sentinel for their event, an intermediate dressage competition, Ethan noticed Parker, Reynolds, and surprisingly Richard Harrington himself, standing together near the judges' area. Their presence confirmed that the stakes extended beyond a simple competition. This was now a public confrontation. When Sentinel's turn came, a huge hush fell over the crowd. Many expected a disappointing performance from the aging horse. Abigail, dressed in borrowed riding attire, guided Sentinel into the arena with calm confidence that belied her 16 years. For a moment, the horse hesitated, seemingly overwhelmed by the crowd and the memories the formal setting might have. Triggered. Then, as if summoning strength from some hidden reserve, Sentinel straightened, his ears pricking forward in concentration. What followed astounded everyone present. The horse moved with a grace and precision that defied his age and recent condition, executing complex maneuvers that weren't even part of the required routine. It was as if Sentinel knew exactly what was at stake and was determined to show his true capabilities. The crowd, initially silent, erupted in applause as Abigail and Sentinel completed their performance. Even the judges seemed impressed, conferring among themselves with surprised expressions. When the scores were announced, placing Sentinel and Abigail third in their division, an extraordinary achievement considering the circumstances, the cheers redoubled. Ethan watched Parker's face darken with rage. The public display had completely undermined the narrative that Sentinel was a neglected animal, seized from a negligent owner. As spectators surrounded Abigail and Sentinel, congratulating them and asking about the horse's remarkable recovery, Parker and Harrington hastily retreated from the arena. The competition's success brought immediate results. By that evening, Margaret had published a follow-up article highlighting Sentinel's performance and raising pointed questions about the motivations behind the charges against Ethan. Several local business owners, impressed by the community spirit shown at the event, offered financial support for Ethan's legal defense. More unexpectedly, the publicity prompted a retired police trainer named Eleanor Simmons to come forward. She had worked with the mounted unit years ago and had been responsible for much of Sentinel's early training. "That horse was special from the beginning," Eleanor told Ethan when she visited the farm days after the competition. "Too smart for his own good, really. That's why I was suspicious when they suddenly transferred me to another division right after that smuggling operation went bad." Eleanor confirmed what Ethan had pieced together. Sentinel had been used to transport documents and small valuable items during operations, utilizing the hidden compartment in his saddle. What's more, she believed the horse had witnessed an exchange between Parker, Harrington, and the smugglers during the operation that Thomas had interrupted. Sentinel always had an uncanny memory for faces and locations, Eleanor explained. If he encountered someone involved in that night's events, he would recognize them immediately. That's why they were so desperate to get rid of him. He was a witness they couldn't control. Armed with Eleanor's testimony, the stable master's diary and Lisa Harrington's financial evidence, James felt confident enough to approach the state attorney's office. After reviewing the material, they agreed to open a preliminary investigation into both Parker and Harrington. The investigation moved quickly, with state authorities seizing records from both the police department and Harrington Enterprises. When word leaked that Parker might be offered a deal in exchange for testimony against Harrington, the pressure proved too much for the corrupt chief. In a dramatic turn of events, Parker attempted to flee the county, but was stopped by none other than Thomas Harrison, who had anticipated his former boss's move. The arrest led to Parker's full confession, implicating Harrington and several others in a smuggling operation that had been running for years, using police resources as cover. With Parker's confession, the charges against Ethan were immediately dropped. The judge not only dismissed the case, but issued a formal apology for the misuse of the legal system. Ownership of Sentinel was officially transferred to Ethan with no conditions or restrictions. The exposure of corruption brought positive changes to Willow Creek. Thomas Harrison was appointed interim chief, with a mandate to reform the department. Richard Harrington faced multiple federal charges, his carefully constructed veneer of respectability shattered. His daughter Lisa, showing remarkable resilience, took control of the legitimate parts of the family business and initiated a foundation to support rural communities affected by the scandal. For Ethan and Abigail, life gradually returned to normal, though with significant improvements. The publicity surrounding Sentinel's story attracted unexpected opportunities. A renowned horse breeder, impressed by the horse's lineage and remarkable recovery, offered Ethan a partnership to establish a small training facility on his property, specializing in rehabilitating former service animals. The venture brought much-needed financial stability to the Miller farm. The old barn was rebuilt, bigger and better than before. Abigail's work with Sentinel had revealed her natural talent with horses, inspiring her to pursue veterinary studies after high school with a focus on equine care. Sentinel himself became something of a local celebrity, occasionally making appearances at community events and schools. Children would gather around as Abigail demonstrated the horse's special skills, while Ethan shared age-appropriate versions of their story, emphasizing themes of loyalty, perseverance, and justice. 1 year after the competition, on a perfect spring day, Ethan watched from the porch as Abigail put Sentinel through his paces in the new training ring. The horse, now healthy and reinvigorated, performed with the same precision and intelligence that had saved them all. Nearby, Eleanor Simmons worked with 2 newly rescued horses, part of their expanding rehabilitation program. "He looks happy," Thomas observed, joining Ethan on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. The former officer, now police chief, had become a regular visitor to the farm. "He is," Ethan agreed, accepting the coffee. "We all are." They watched in comfortable silence as Sentinel completed his routine and trotted over to the fence, where Abigail rewarded him with an apple and affectionate pats. "You know," Thomas said thoughtfully, "when I suggested you take Sentinel that day, I never imagined it would lead to all this. But somehow, I think that horse knew exactly what he was doing all along." Ethan smiled, remembering the desperate animal he'd first brought home and the remarkable journey they'd shared since then. "Some souls just know where they belong," he replied, "and some partnerships are meant to be. In the paddock, Sentinel raised his head, ears pricked forward as if listening to their conversation. Then, with a soft nicker that sounded remarkably like agreement, he nudged Abigail gently and turned back to his training, a once-forgotten guardian who had found his true home and purpose at last. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and Sentinel's journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. Their story reminds us that second chances and unwavering loyalty can transform lives in unexpected ways. For more emotionally captivating stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist that explores similar themes of courage and redemption. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If you enjoyed this tale of a special bond between man and horse, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and celebrate the triumph of the human spirit. Share your thoughts and reactions in the comments section below. We'd love to know which moment in Ethan and Sentinel's journey resonated with you the most. Until our next story, remember that sometimes our greatest allies come in unexpected forms.